Hey there, and welcome to level 6 in PROMPT.ML. So again, we got a function in here which is taking user input, but this time it's taking user input in this format. What do I mean by this? If you simply put any data in here, let's say cat, it's basically going to say invalid form data. Why? Because this application in here is basically expecting user to write data in this format, which is this. If I copy it and paste it, you can see it's totally working fine and we are not getting any kind of error. Don't look at this HTML source or get confused. We're going to look at it later, but before we are going to look at this function in here. So what this function is doing, this function is taking user input, then inside a segment variable it is storing the user input, but before that it's also splitting the user input into two parts, before the hashtag and after the hashtag. So if I simply open my text editor, let me show you how it's actually storing the user input. Yeah, the segments variable is basically storing user input in two parts, the URL and the JSON data separated by comma. This whole data is being stored in this segment variable. Now another variable in here, form URL, is storing the segments data which is at the 0 index. What do you mean by this? So this URL is at index 0 and this JSON data is at index 1. So form URL is basically storing the URL which is at index 0. So form URL contains the URL and form data contains the JSON data which is at index 1. So we understand this thing in here. Now let's see this thing which says var form document.create element form. So this code in here is basically creating an element form, and that form is going to have action attribute and method attribute. How it's going to look like? It's going to look like this. This JavaScript code is creating a form element which is going to have an action attribute and a method attribute. As you can see, the method attribute is post. So I'm going to write here post. What is this action attribute? This action attribute is storing form URL, and we know that form URL is basically this URL. So if I copy it and paste it inside the action, this is how it's going to look like. So this is what this 3 line of code is doing. Now we got a for loop, and this for loop is basically creating an input element, and then it is looping through this JSON data. So basically it's creating an input element which is going to have a name attribute, and name attribute is storing this name in here, and it's creating an value attribute. As you can see, input set attribute value. So if I say value, and this value is going to have mat, because this is what written here, right? Or this is what written in here. Yep. So this is what this for loop is doing. Yeah, this whole function is basically creating a form element and an input element which is going to have user data. As you can see, whatever you are putting in or whatever the user is putting in here is getting inside the attributes or getting reflected inside the HTML attribute. Hence, this attribute value and this thing in here is user controllable data. I mean, whatever you're going to write is going to reflect here, right? So maybe we can write some JavaScript code and execute some payload, stuff like that. How are we going to do that? But before that, you have to look at this HTML source. Now you won't get confused. This form action is having the form URL, and it's having method post, and then input name, and value mat. So if I change the value here, let's say John, As you can see, the value has been changed in here, and you can also change the URL or whatever you are going to write. It's going to reflect in here in the form action. Now let's have a look at this script in here. So we know that why we were getting invalid form data, because when it was not in this format, so we were getting this error. What if we write some kind of JavaScript code in here? Can we do that? Let's use pseudo protocol. Okay, I cannot do anything more further. You can see it's already saying action forbidden, as you can see in here. So what this script is doing here is, this script basically checks if there is any kind of JavaScript code, and if there is some kind of JavaScript code, I don't want you to submit the form. It's only going to submit the form if there is action attribute. So if there is action attribute, it's going to submit the form, otherwise not. I'm gonna write my payload first, and I'm gonna change the JSON data, and as you can see, it's working. Now let me explain you why is it working. We actually bypassed it. Yeah, so when you put an action attribute in here, you can see the input name now has this action attribute. This script in here is basically checking if there is action attribute or not. If there is action attribute, submit the code, otherwise don't. So when you put an action in this JSON data, this script is basically checking the action. Oh yeah, the action does exist, and it also doesn't have any kind of JavaScript payload, so it's basically going to submit the form. But with that, it's also submitting our payload in here, which is this. So somehow we are able to bypass it, and this script is basically checking for this but not this. So this is how it's working. You can also use prompt in here, prompt, and yeah, you won. Hope you get the idea how it's working. You basically just bypass the code by using an action attribute, which is what the script was actually looking for to submit the code. And yeah, that's how it works. Thanks for watching.